Tina, I need to know if you can hear me.
Hey, hi, I can hear you.
Okay. Are there people
Oh,
on?
yep, yep. We got people, we got noise. So you should be good to start.
All right. Just a second. All right. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we certainly can.
Just a second here. Oh, hold on. This is trying to get rid of the panel on the side. How do you get rid of the panel?
You should be able to just click on the top of it and drag it away.
Wow. This is okay. I'm just going to leave it. There we go. Sorry, everybody. I'm not used to this GoToWebinar. Wow. Wow. Just a minute. Let me see if I can move it this way. Get it. It's like right in the middle of the screen. Do you see that little panel right in the middle of the screen?
No, we can't see it.
Okay. All right. All right. Well, let's go ahead and get started. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our payroll quarterly review session this morning. My name is Jeanette. I'll be your instructor for today. I am a certified Sage 300 CRE consultant. I was an end user. I actually worked for Sage for many years, and I've been out consulting many more years. So hopefully I'm going to be able to impart some good information to you today as far as getting through your quarterly tasks for payroll. So before we get started, I want to look at a couple of things or talk about a couple of things that you need to make sure that you do before you actually begin the quarter end. One thing that you want to make sure that you do is there's a couple things here we're going to talk about as far as getting all the information in, making sure you're on the right version. We're going to take a look at the tax preparation reports that we have out there provided by Sage. If you run into any problems with those reports, meaning there's differences between the Sage reports and maybe the Atrix forms, we're going to talk about what could cause those differences and then how to correct them. We'll take a look at the Recalculate Subject 2 task that you can run to rebuild some of those fields. We'll talk about some error correction. And then at the end, we're going to actually jump into Atrix and look at a couple of forms before the end of the class. Now, you guys should have a handout. Hopefully you were able to print those out. It's like 17 pages, and it pretty much covers everything that we're going to talk about this morning. There are screenshots in it and some explanations. So hopefully you've got that printed out so that you can take notes. Okay, so the first thing you need to make sure that you do is that you're sure that all the information for the quarter has been entered. So one of the things I always have people do is check the inquiry, check information, check activity inquiry on the new file to make sure that all the checks have been posted for the current quarter. The other thing I have them verify is that any manual checks or corrections that need to be done for that quarter have been taken care of. And then I would have you back up your payroll files using tools, file tools inside Sage. Remember that going out to Windows Explorer and backing up your files in just your main data folder is not going to pick up all the pieces. Anytime that you do a backup or a copy of your files, you need to be sure that you use tools, file tools, because that will pick up all the pieces. There's a file in your main data folder. There's also subfolders and files within the pervasive data folder that sits inside your current data folder. So tools, file tools, again, gets all the pieces needed to get a good full backup of your files. And then the other thing that I would recommend that you do is that you make sure you're on the current version. Everybody should have upgraded to either 16.1 or 17.1 for year end. So if you're on 16.1, you should be on update 8. If you're on 17.1, you should be on revision 7. And you can check that if you go into the software. And I'm hoping that you guys can see this. Under Help, there is an About. Now, this is in all the applications. It's also in TS Main, and it's also on the desktop, so that you can come in and you can look to see what version you're on. And for today, we're going to be looking at 17.1, and I've got the year-end release installed, excuse me, on this machine. Now, the next thing that you're going to want to do is run some reports inside Sage to get ready to run the actual quarterly reports through Atrix. So we're going to take a look at some of these reports and kind of talk about when you'd use them, how you'd use them. We're going to look at the 941 preparation report. We're going to take a look at the quarterly employee count. Some states require that you report how many employees you have working at your business each month. We're also going to look at a couple of subject to reports. We'll look at the subject to employee, which will list all the employee taxes, the subject to employer for those taxes. There's also a date range subject to report that we're going to look at. And that's going to come in handy if you've already closed the month. So if you, obviously you're already into April running payroll. If you haven't run your quarterlies yet, you can run a report using a date range that will give you totals for all of those taxes as well. We're not ready for that yet. So I'm going to jump into the software here. Now you've got screenshots and samples of these reports in your handout. So the first one we're going to take a look at is the 941. All of these reports that we're looking at are right here under the drop-down for Reports, Tax Preparation. The 941 preparation report is here. It defaults to check date. There is a drop-down here that you can run this report by period end date, but I would say for the quarterlies, you're going to run this by check date because that is the true accounting date for payroll, and that's what the government is working off of. They don't care when the employee earned it. They want to know when it was actually paid. So you're going to run this by check date, and you'll give it a date range. And I'm running this off the sample data, so we're a little bit in the past here. You'll give it the date range, and then you'll do a print preview. And I would, again, I would go ahead and print this out so that you have a hard copy of this so that you can compare this to the totals then that come up when you run the 941 report through Atrix. Now, if you have a reporting requirement that you need to show number of employees, if we go to Reports, Tax Preparation, we have a quarterly employee count report here. And all you need to do is provide the state, the quarter, and the year. And again, this will give you a list of your employees, and it marks whether or not they worked in that month. And then at the end, it will give you a grand total for that state. Okay, the subject to reports are also listed here under tax preparation. You have subject to employee for those employee taxes, employer. This is the date range that I was talking about that you can run if you've already closed the month of March, which would also have closed the quarter. You can also run, we've got a prior period subject to for both employee and employer. And I'm going to show you the difference here. If you were still in March, you could run subject to employee. And again, this will give you a breakdown by tax. It shows you your list of employees in a series of columns for year to date, quarter to date, and month to date. So again, you may want to print this report out so that you have it handy for the Atrix reporting. You can also run the same report, only this time select employer. And again, it gives you a breakdown by tax, lists the employees. And then again, the amounts. Now, if you've already closed the month, which would have closed the quarter, instead of running this prior period subject to, let me show you why. Because this brings up not only the prior quarter figures, which the sample data doesn't have anything in it, but in your situation it would. These other columns could confuse everybody. There's a prior year and a prior month that may not be of value. You'd have to be focusing on these middle columns to get the first quarter. So instead of running those reports, what I would recommend during the year, this might come in handy if you were at year end and you've already closed into January and you want to look at your prior year for 2018 and get the fourth quarter there and maybe even the December. These reports are perfect for that. But during the year, those columns are not going to be relevant. So what I would recommend is that you run with the subject to date range. And you run it off your current file. And it gives you the option here to run either employee taxes or employer taxes. And then you'll give it a date range. And again, it gives you a breakdown by tax, by employee, and it shows you that the taxable and subject to and the tax amount that was withheld for each employee for that tax for that time frame. It's actually computing this off the checks in the current file. So this would be a good report, again, to run if you've already moved into April and you just need to see just the first quarter. And again, this is where you would see I changed it to pull employer taxes instead. Okay. All right, so let's say that you have run all these reports and you may have run some sample reports through Atrix and you're finding that the numbers don't match. They don't line up and there's, you think you may have the wrong subject to or taxable amounts. The first thing that I would recommend that you check are any of your deductions that need to be either taxable or not, to make sure that those have been marked correctly. So at the bottom of page 4 in your handout, I've got a screenshot of setup deductions that shows a 401k. Oops, do that right, 401. Let's see, let's grab it this way. A lot of users will set up their 401k and they incorrectly check these boxes down here at the bottom. So what these boxes here mean is where it says before employee taxes, that means that this deduction is exempt from taxes, these taxes. So you need to make sure that you have all of these taxes checked correctly for both employee and employer. So if the deduction was set up, let's say, and by accident, none of these boxes were checked. we would need to go ahead and check the boxes now, and then in just a bit I'm going to get into the Recalculate Subject 2. Once this is marked, we can run a tool that will rerun the checks against the employee master file based on these new settings, and it will recalculate the Subject 2 and taxable fields. So you need to make sure you need to go through your deductions. I would go through all of them just to verify. Just maybe start at the beginning and go through each one. You can use your next button to next through and just double check that you've got the correct setup down here marked as far as the taxes are concerned. One of the other issues that sometimes happens in payroll can be the adjustment method on the taxes on the employee setup. So this is at the top of page 5. If you go in under Setup Employees and you bring up an employee and you take a look at the Taxes button, you'll notice that there is an adjustment column here, and it's got a drop-down available. It defaults to no adjustment, which means it's going to just calculate normally based on the setup under setup taxes and the number of pay periods they get paid per year. So it's running their earnings against the annual tax table. Excuse me. I've seen customers come in and mark a tax as being exempt when it should have been marked as no tax. So what happens is if it's marked as exempt, the Subject 2 and the taxable fields will not populate, and obviously no tax. But if you mark it at no tax, it will populate the Subject 2 and the taxable fields, but not calculate any tax. So I guess it depends on the type of employee this is. I think some of younger workers, they need to report their earnings, but you're maybe not taxing them for federal withholding. Instead of marking them as exempt, you need to mark them as no tax. So if this was marked incorrectly and they're not showing up with taxable and Subject 2 amounts on those reports, all you need to do is come in here and change the adjustment method to no tax. And then again, when we run the Recalculate Subject 2 tool, it will build those fields. So then their earnings will show up on the reports. Okay. All right, so that could be one. Again, this could be one issue that could cause your reports to be incorrect. The other thing that could happen is you received a new tax rate and limit maybe for your unemployment, and you have forgotten to come in here under taxes and you have not updated the tax ID. So the percent and the limit is incorrect. So we can correct both of these, and again we can run Recalculate Subject 2 and it will correct the Subject 2 and the taxable amounts. It won't correct the tax though, and again I'll show you here a little bit later how you can come in and correct taxes with a dummy manual check. And we'll talk about some scenarios about how or why you would actually do that. Okay, so we talked about deduction setup. This is also true on pays. You may have a pay that was set up that was marked incorrectly as far as the taxing is concerned. Again, we can correct that, and then Recalculate Subject 2 will rebuild those fields. Okay, we talked about the tax setup. We talked about the limit, maybe even the percentage being incorrect. Now, what you don't want to play with are your Social Security and Medicare taxes. These are called self-adjusting taxes, and they use a self-adjusting formula. So the Social Security and Medicare should be correct always, because every time you process your payroll, it recalculates that tax, and it's basing it on the tax that's already been withheld. So if your Social Security and Medicare taxes are incorrect, what you need to look at is any manual checks that you may have entered into the system where those taxes were entered incorrectly. Because what will happen is if it's done at the end, then your reports are going to be incorrect. If it's done in the middle of a quarter or the middle of a month, it will make an adjusting entry on the current check. So it'll try to adjust itself. It'll either calculate too high or too low, again, based on the totals in the employee master file. So just keep that in mind, that all the social taxes and all the med taxes, those are two sets of taxes that you should never have to manually correct or recalculate, because they recalculate every time you process. Now, the Recalculate Subject to tool. So when do we need to use this tool? We need to use it when we have made corrections to a pay or a tax or a deduction or even an employee. So we need to rebuild those subject to and taxable fields in the master file. So what happens to the data files? So we use either a current file or a history file when we run this tool. And what happens to the data files is that there is a field on each of those records within each of those checks that signifies whether that record is exempt or not from a particular tax. So it's actually changing the records in the data files themselves, as well as the master file. So what if the data was moved to history for the current year? You need to make sure that you clear the taxable and subject to period totals. So we're going to talk about a couple scenarios when we get into the software. I'm going to actually show you how to run this. It depends on whether you keep your current year totally in the current file, or if you are moving things either to named files or to history during the year. Now, what if manual adjustments were made to the master file in a previous quarter? They get overridden, because this is going to go back and it's going to adjust everywhere that it can. So it would adjust the current month, it would adjust the current quarter, the prior quarter, the current year, the prior year, depending on what files you use. Okay. And then what periods of time can I use the tool? Current year, current quarter, prior quarter, current month, prior month. So it's affecting all of those periods of time when you run the Recalculate Subject to. So instead of looking at this, I'm going to go ahead and jump into the software again. All right. Recalculate is under Tools, and it's Recalculate Subject to. The first thing it asks you for here, and there's a screenshot in your handout on page 6, is which transaction file to use. Most people will have their current file represent the current year, so they'll only have to run this once, and they'll select current. If you are moving stuff from current to history at the end of each month, then you're going to have to run this a couple of times. So you'll probably start out with the current file, and then where it's where it says which year to run, it automatically defaults to the current year. And then because I'm running this on the current file, it's asking me, do I want to clear the taxable and subject to period totals? And so I'll put a check mark there so that it does. I want it to start those fields out at 0 and rebuild them based on the checks that are in the current file. So here I would go ahead and run start. Now, if you've only got one employee that this affects, and you've got a lot of employees and you want this to go a little faster, you can use the ranges button and you can select the one person that you need to recalculate. You don't have to recalculate the entire set of employees. Okay. So again, you would run this once. If your current year is in the current file, you only have to run it once and you're done. If you are moving things from current to history or current to current because you've got named files, you'll run it the first time, you'll check the box to clear the totals, and then you run it. Then you run it again, and maybe this time you pick the history file because everything else is in history for the current year. I don't have a history file. Okay, we'll pretend. Oops, recalculate. I'll pick current again. This time, you'll leave this unchecked because you don't want to zero out what you just updated into your master file. Okay, so maybe the current file has March in it, but the history file has January and February. So you run it the first time on the current file, you check the box so it pulls in March. Then you run it a second time, you do not check the box, so it brings in January and February. Now, if you run this and you forget to check the box, let's say everything is in current, you pull it up, you click and you start, and then you run your reports and oh my gosh, everything is double. It's because you forgot to check this box. You can run it again, check the box. When you run your reports, the amounts will be in there only once and they should be correct. So this program, it doesn't hurt to run it multiple times. Now, let's pretend that it was our unemployment that was incorrect. We had forgotten to change the limit. And so a couple employees went over that limit in the quarter, and so it stopped calculating unemployment. And now we need to get that unemployment amount, the tax amount, updated. Remember that this program only updates taxable and subject to. If you need to correct a tax, you can come in here with enter checks. Okay. And let's go with, we'll do the end of the quarter. Okay, so I can put in a dummy check. Learn to type. And I'll just use the quarter end date. Enter out of the top. And what I'm really trying to record here is not any pay or deduction or fringe. What I want to correct is taxes. So I'm going to click the tax button to get down here. That tax button becomes a toggle. Notice that up here it says employee tax, but the button down here says employer tax. So I can click that and it changes it to the employer tax area. And I can put in the tax ID that I want to adjust, and I can put in the amount. Now, if I look at the check info on this check, I'm not paying the employee any money. There's no net. There's no direct deposit. I'm just adjusting employer taxes. So I can then stick a manual check number on this. Make one up. give it a check date that fits the quarter. Yep. I'm not going to print it though. Okay. And I can accept it. It does force me because I made a change. I'm going to uncheck this because I don't want anything to come in. It has to be processed. Okay. And I might even just double check the check info to make sure that this is what I need it to be. Then accept it and finish. Now I can now post this zero check. And it's going to print out on my printer here. So it is set up a zero check went over to cash management that I can reconcile with my next bank statement. It will update $15 to the SUI tax itself, and then I can pay that tax on my next tax deposit, and then this will show up on my quarterly report. All right. Now, if the tax is actually an employee tax that they need to pay, there's probably ways that you can get around that. If you need to report it in the first quarter, you could wait and adjust that tax in the second quarter. I think that's going to have to be on a case-by-case basis. I don't think we'll get into that discussion right now. But this one that I just demonstrated to you, this is something that may come up, and it's easily corrected without affecting any of the paid totals on the employee. So we're adjusting an employer tax with a zero net check. Now, the other thing that I have that I've given you a sample of, and I've got this screenshot here. This is also in your handout on page 7. If you find that you've got checks that either were entered incorrectly or don't belong in the quarter or never should have been either printed or recorded, maybe they were printed but they were never voided, you can use the tasks void checks to either totally get rid of the check or retain it back in the new file with a status of new so that you can correct it, reprocess it, and maybe even print it or make it a manual check. Just depends on what the scenario is or the situation. The reason I put this in here is because I wanted to show you when you void a check that's already been posted, you not only get this retain this check as new option to set it back up, which you can uncheck, and then it just voids it out of the system completely. But there's also these two fields that become active, this use original accounting date and use original check date. The accounting date is for GL and job cost only. So if this needs to go backwards in time, if this was a check that was issued in a prior month, you can leave that check mark checked and it will use the original accounting date for those applications. Or if you uncheck this, it'll bring up a field over here on the side like it did for new check date. It'll say new accounting date, and you can put in the date that you want this void to affect in GL and job cost. Now, use original check date. This is for payroll. Remember that payroll uses the check date for its own accounting date. It doesn't use this accounting date that we're talking about up here. It uses the check date itself to determine where to reverse these numbers from on the employee record. Okay. So in this example, we unchecked use original check date, and this field popped up so that we could actually put in a check date, maybe even in more in the future, so that we're actually voiding in a current month or a current quarter. Okay, so at this point, we have run our preparation reports for the quarter. We have made corrections as far as changing pays, deductions, taxes, employees. We've reran Recalculate Subject 2. We've entered dummy manual checks if we needed to. We've voided checks if we needed to. We actually reran. We need to rerun our Subject 2 reports again to verify that everything is correct. So the next thing we would do then is come into Payroll and run our federal and state reporting. So you're all aware now that all the quarterly reports themselves are now created through Atrix. Now I've got pages now. Once you come in, I'm going to actually show just one. I'll show a state form, and then I'm going to show the 941 form for the federal. Regardless of which one you choose, it actually goes out and it double checks against the Atrix site, which is done right here. They actually just put an update on today. Okay, this is great. So the screens now are going to match. So here it's telling us that we've got an update. Do you want to update now? So before we can actually get into the software, we have to say yes. So you should be running this from a workstation that has access to the internet. So we'll say yes to that for the automatic update. And then we'll get the window on page 8, and we'll go ahead and say do an automatic update. Depending on your situation, if you're running this from a workstation that does not have access to the internet, you can download the update maybe at the server that might have a connection to the internet, and then you can take that file that you download and move it over to the workstation that runs the forms and manually run the update from there. So in our example here, we're going to go ahead and update. It's going through and it's looking for forms that have changed. Now, it's not just your state. It's checking all states because Atrix updates all the forms for all the states and it downloads them to your site regardless of where you're actually located. So you see it's running through a whole list, and it may or may not come up with a big list, might come up with a short list. Yep. So even though it ran through all those, these are the ones that it found that have actually changed since yesterday. Okay. So when this list comes up, just hit next, and it is going out and updating. So this is the screen that you would see at the top of page 9. Okay, and when it's done, you'll get this update complete screen. You just click close, and then you have to go back to tasks and start the program again. Okay, once you have all your forms updated and it didn't find anything else that it needed to update, we're doing a state one first, so I'm going to go ahead and use Oregon. But this has got all the states are listed. I'm using Oregon because that's what the sample data is, so that you can see the report. So we're going to go ahead and run the quarterly report. And I'm going to change the year here because, again, the sample data is a little bit in the past. And I'm also going to unselect. On this window, you'll see a list of employees. You probably just hit next from there. Everybody should be selected. I'm going to select just a couple of people so that I'm hoping it'll run a little bit faster. Okay, on the next screen, again, so we're all the way up to page 11 at the top. Then you just click Generate. Sometimes these are fast and sometimes they're not. I think right after an update, the forms run a little bit slower. But then after you've run a couple, it starts loading the forms a little bit faster. All right, so this is the screen, the little screen that tells you to make sure that you correct everything in red. You can check the box here to not show this message again. I've just always left it on. Just click OK when this comes up. Again, it just reminds you, fix everything in red. Okay, and then here I've got a couple of columns here that I need to correct before it will let me go forward. Sorry for my scratchy voice. Okay. And we'll just leave that at 0. Again, even the fields that they default to 0, it forces you to to click the 0 in there. All right, we'll just go ahead and fill this out here. All right. And then depending on how many pages you have, just double check the pages to make sure. And again, this little bar is in the way. Just double check to make sure that you've got all the red areas corrected. And then up here at the top, again, you can use the save button, the print button, and then the next step. I'm going to go ahead and save this, and we'll get to the next step. Oops, yep. Okay. 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 All right. You'll get this agree. Once you're ready to move forward to the e-filing, go ahead and click. If you click double check, it takes you back to the form and you can make more, make corrections if you need to. And then if you click, after you click agree, click the next step again and get rid of the thing. And then this is, we aren't actually going to e-file here, but if you are using Atrix to e-file your forms, you'll click the e-file button, and that will connect you with the Atrix server. And then you fill out the rest of the screens, and depending on whether you're paying per form, and you'll have to make a payment for that, or if you're on one of their support plans, the amount will be 0. I actually use Atrix for myself, for my little one-person consulting firm, and I pay an amount for the entire year, and I can run as many forms as I need to, and I just pay one flat lump sum amount at the beginning of each year. Okay. All right, so that would be a state form. So let me close out of here, and let's do the federal form. All right, I'm going to do a 941 Schedule B, and I'll go ahead and roll it back to the year that sample data is in. And again, I'm going to unselect everybody and just pick a couple of employees so that it might go a little bit faster. Now, what you can do on both of these is you can get the form to come up, get everything filled in correctly, and you can print that form and then cancel out of the program and just compare your form to your other preparation reports and subject to reports to make sure that everything looks right, and then come back in and go through the final run. All right, so here on the federal form, I'm going to click OK to that. And again, I've got some red areas that I need to correct. So again, I would correct that, go to the second page, make my corrections here. Got some other things in here that I need to fill in. Okay. So everything looks good except that there's like 2 cents. I have to pay 2 cents. Fine. But I can go ahead and I can print this out, and then I can go on to the next step. I can agree. Next step again. Let's get rid of that message that keeps coming up. And again, I'm back at my e-file button. Okay. So the actual running of the forms is pretty simple, pretty basic. I think the hard part about the quarter end is making sure that you have all of your amounts correct. That you've held the correct amount of tax, that you've got the right amount for subject to and taxable. Now there is one other way to make corrections on stuff. I would stay away from this if you can. You can turn on audit setup activity and manually make changes, but I would make that the last option. So if a dummy manual check won't fix it, or Recalculate subject to won't fix it, then I think you should work with support or with a consultant to determine if you need to take this step. Okay, so tips and reminders for your quarter end. You want to make sure everything has been posted for the quarter. Make sure that you're on a current version, and make sure you have a good backup. Because remember that you're not only, when you close the month, it's also closing the quarter. So there's a lot of fields in there on all the different tabs and buttons that are being affected. And if something happens during that step, during that close month step, power goes out, somebody accidentally unplugs something, and it aborts in the middle, there's no recovery for that. You have to go to a backup, restore the backup, and run it again. We have a little bit of time, so I don't know if, I think if you want to put your questions, we might be able to answer a couple of questions if you have them before the class is over. Otherwise, we can, I can have you send your questions into Tina, and she can forward them to me, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you might have about the session or about the quarter end. So Tina, do you want to go ahead and unmute yourself and let me know if anybody's asked any questions so far? Tina, are you there?
Hi, yes, I'm here. Sorry, just took me a minute to get unmuted. So yeah, so questions. I will open it up. If anybody has any questions, you can just click the little hand up thing and we can unmute you. Nope. Okay. I guess we're not getting any questions right now. Or you can also send them in the chat.
I don't. The only people I see in the chat are you and me.
Yep. Yeah. No. If anybody has any, they can send them, but I don't think that anybody does. So.
Okay. All right. So, well, if you come across any questions later, if you want to send those to Tina, she can forward them to me, and I'll be happy to help with that. Otherwise, I think we're good.
Awesome.
We're
Thanks.
done.
Thanks, Tina.
Okay. All right. I hope to see you in the next class.
Thanks. Bye, everybody.
Thanks. Bye.